Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. If you were to ask me the most pressing issues designers are facing today, I would likely say that the questions we're facing revolve around questions of decolonization and decarbonization. How do designers enable systems of oppression in favor of the powerful? How are we working towards a more sustainable planet? How is our work a tool of liberation, of justice, of longevity? These two issues, decolonization and decarbonization, are not often talked about as something connected. We don't, or at least I didn't, fully understand how deeply they are related. If we live within a dominant worldview that favors extraction of labor, extraction of resources, extraction of human worth, then of course this would extend to the planet. To truly decarbonize, then, we first must decolonize. This is the nexus of the profound work and research of my guest today, Adrian Lahoud. Adrian is an architect, he's an urban designer, a researcher, and is the dean of the School of Architecture at the Royal College of Art. He was previously the director of the MA program at the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths and a research fellow at Forensic Architecture. He was also the curator of the inaugural Sharjah Architecture Triennial in 2019, and all of his work revolves around these questions of decarbonization and decolonization. In this wide-ranging and, for me, very powerful conversation, Adrian and I talk about this relationship. We talk about architecture and design's role here and why we need to rethink what we mean when we say architecture. We also talk about what this looks like in practice for him as a dean of an architecture program. How does this influence how he runs a program and shapes a research culture? This is one of those conversations that I found myself reflecting back on often in the days after we recorded it, and I'm really, really excited to share it with you today. If you like this episode and what we do here at Scratching the Surface, I hope you consider supporting us on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus interviews, full transcripts, an exclusive monthly newsletter, all while helping to keep this show free for everyone all the time. You can head over to patreon.com/surface podcast to get all the details and to sign up and support the show. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here is my conversation with Adrian Lahoud. I want to start this conversation, though. I'm really interested in the way that you frame your own research. I've heard you talk many times about your research being about the intersection or the connection or the overlap between decarbonization and decolonization. Tell me about how those fit together, or what it is about that intersection that you find so interesting.
Yeah, sure. I think in the most simple terms, you can trace the situation that we're in with respect to climate change as the consequence of a kind of worldview.
Mm.
And that worldview has become dominant and effectively means that we've learned to see the things around us, the natural world, but also each other, as resources.
Mm.
um, Things to be extracted, things that we can apply various forms of calculations to in order to measure them, to financialize them, to commodify them, and to make them circulate. And so, for example, um, it would be inconceivable if we wind the clock back far enough to think about owning a piece of land. Now it's a completely naturalized idea. And that idea of property has expanded into things like intellectual property, but also, things like carbon trading. So, for example, we have an atmospheric chemical um, that we can calculate. We can calculate its concentration. We can calculate how much an area of forest absorbs, and we can use that to create a value, which we can then monetize and trade and use to create things like carbon offsets. And so it's that extractive worldview that is has become dominant. And so the connection and the way it's become dominant is through a colonial project. I think colonial, in many senses, not just the literal, physical, violent taking of land, but the transformation in people's psyche, in their um, mental ecology, in what they value, in what they understand, and what they count as relevant or irrelevant in the world. That has had to transform. So our minds and our souls have been colonized, or have to be
Mm-hmm.
colonized, as part of the kind of the physical process of colonization. And the outcome of that is the absolute dominance of this worldview. And so for me, that's really where this connection between these two things comes in. And in fact, I think it's impossible to separate one from the other. And of course, I mean, there are so many historical examples, but of course, the one that's most often cited is, of course, the commodification of black bodies as part of the slave trade,
Right.
as the kind of like, in some sense, the beginning of that.
I think this is so fascinating because, when I first heard you talk about this, it was one of those moments where it's like, this is so obvious, and why have I not why have I not made this connection before?
Yeah,
That this idea that to truly decarbonize, we have to first decolonize.
yeah,
And I'm wondering if you could you talk a little bit about how you came to this connection and how you started to see these as linked? Because like I said, it was one of those, I felt so dumb the first I heard you say. It was like, it's so obvious, but I had never thought of it that way before. How did you start to arrive at this line of thinking?
yeah. That's a good question. Try and give you a kind of relative concise
take
answer.
your take your time. Yeah.
Um, so my research work really starts off many years ago, looking at post conflict situations in cities.
Mm,
My parents were born in Lebanon and emigrated to Australia, which is where I was studied. And I returned back, and I was really interested in the aftermath of a 15-year civil war there,
mm,
but also the series of conflicts that had taken place after that. And I was trying to understand, how does a society start to put itself back together after this conflict? What survives, and
right.
what kinds of social practices um, do societies develop to make themselves resilient and able to withstand that kind of violence? And that expanded, and I started to become interested in the way natural disasters did similar kinds of things. And I spent some time looking at New Orleans and Katrina as another example. Fast forward a little bit, and I started working on a doctoral dissertation at the University of Technology, Sydney, with Andrew Benjamin, looking at the idea of scale. And at the time, I was running. So yeah, I was coordinating an urban design program at the time, and I was really struggling to think theoretically and systematically about how you teach urban design, because cities are really big, complex things,
Yeah.
and you could start almost anywhere. Um, and out of that emerged quite a long, significant piece of research into the idea of scale in architecture.
Mm,
And what I discovered while I was doing this research work into scale is that climate scientists were also grappling with another really big, complex thing made up of many parts operating at different temporal and spatial scales. and they were also working in similar kinds of ways to what I was proposing within the thesis. And so I started to make this connection between what was happening in climate science at the time, and then my own thinking about cities. As you know, how do you and
Mm,
it was really it was a response to a very practical problem, which is how do you teach really complex things to students? Yeah,
right.
how do you
Right.
break them up into parts?
Yeah. Yeah.
What is a kind of natural part? How do you reconnect those parts? How do you get students to be able to connect things that are happening at very small scales to things that are larger scales and more historical, versus things that might be more, ephemeral and temporary, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and so during that research, one of the chapters in the PhD was focused on the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Conference, and at that
Mm,
conference,
yeah.
there was a very famous moment where the lead negotiator of the G77 at the time, Lumumba de Arping, accused the G8 actually of trying to colonize the sky,
Mm,
because they had circulated a draft text, effectively negotiating um, without the participation of the global south, and
right.
coming up with a deal that they thought they could just impose on the global south. And it was really one of, for me, an incredibly important moment, because it was the first time the global south, these 132 developing nations, arrived at the climate summit with a single negotiating position, and they
Mm,
rejected this G8 deal, and the talks collapsed. Um, and and I think that was, for me, a moment in which it was made incredibly explicit that when we're arguing over something like 1.5 degree temperature increase or a 1.6
right.
degree temperature increase, actually what we're really arguing about is a distribution of life and death. So that's the moment where this kind of connection between decarbonization and decolonization for me becomes really explicit and politically active.
So I have to, you started to answer my next question, and so I'm going to ask you this question in sort of two ways that are this might be the same question, or I might be asking you sort of two questions that are related.
Mm.
But I'm interested in sort of how architecture overlaps then with these questions of decolonization and decarbonization. But maybe a better way to ask that question is, how is or why is architecture a good lens through which to sort of tackle these political questions that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think you can answer that in two different ways. So, one, if you understand architecture as a certain structure of knowledge
Mm,
that is very attentive and conscious to space in relationship to social organization and material construction technologies, etc. That knowledge, and those skills that come with learning architecture can be deployed in all kinds of ways, because that knowledge is socially useful and relevant beyond
mm,
making buildings. So, for example, the most obvious example is the work that forensic architecture do, which is
right,
an organization that I worked with for
right,
some time. And they take architectural knowledge and they deploy it in investigations around human rights violations. So that's one answer. So you can just take the knowledge and skills
yeah,
that you learn and you can make them do other things in the world. But then, let's say if we think about architecture in terms of buildings and construction, then I think one thing that became extremely interesting to me, and is really, I guess, what I've been working on in the last few years, is the way non-Western societies structure their environment,
mm,
and in a sense embody alternative sets of relationships between themselves and the world around them. So if we wind back to what I said at the beginning, which is that colonization, it kind of extinguishes these alternative worldviews and
uh-huh,
replaces them with a worldview that treats everything as a resource. If we turn to various land rights struggles, social struggles around the world led by indigenous groups, we have so much to learn, because we can also see in each one of those contexts, a set of alternative values being deployed. Yeah,
right, right,
and for me, I think those moments are incredibly precious. And what's interesting about them is that they also confront. It's been very confrontational because also what we the kinds of things we expect to refer to when we say the word architecture might not always look like buildings,
Right.
but they might do the same kind of work. Yeah, they might organize
Yeah.
people socially. They might, create ways of allocating resources that are,
Yeah.
equitable. They might shelter people, or they might organize their passage through a landscape. All of the things that we kind of understand architecture or, urbanism to do apply in a different context, but just look very different. And I think for me that is a kind of huge like epistemological provocation to us.
Yeah.
And I think when I go back and think about my own architectural education and how incredibly Eurocentric or Western centric it was,
Mm.
um, I realized that there's a vast realm of human experience that's been left out of canonical understandings of what is architecture and what's not.
Right.
And I think that's really exciting. It's tragic, but it's an exciting moment because actually it just points to the fact there's a ton of work to do to start to think through what the implications are for us.
Yeah, I mean, part of the project then becomes decolonizing what we mean by by architecture itself. I've heard you talk about sort of this. I don't know if you want to call it sort of a history or an understanding of architecture that looks as architecture as building and specifically as shelters and dwellings,
Yeah.
and that sort of presupposes what we mean when we say architecture. Can you? This is a big question. Can you sort of briefly talk about this idea of shelter and dwelling and how this maybe relates to a whether that's like a colonized or a limited understanding of what architecture is or what architecture can be?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the really short version of it is that I think that the most fundamental presupposition about a Western conception of architecture is that its role is to shelter us.
Mm.
But implied in that presupposition is two things. One is that the world out there is some kind of threat; it's dangerous. And the second thing is that we are somehow vulnerable
Mm.
and therefore subject to
Right.
predation, bad
Right.
weather, what have you. And architecture kind of intervenes, yeah, to
Mm.
insulate us. Um, but in that presupposition is a relationship between the organism and the environment that isn't universally held by different societies.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So that's just interesting. Your house. It might be more relevant to say that the roof space in your house is um, is a resting place of gods,
Right.
or that
Right.
your garden, or the landscape around your house is the resting place of your ancestors.
Right.
Than it is to say that it's your, I don't know, front lawn or the
Right.
things that
Right.
does the ventilation,
Yeah.
because then suddenly if the land around you is or the building materials of your house have a direct connection to your ancestors, then your relationship to your environment is not protection from a threat, it's care.
Mm.
Yeah, and so suddenly you start to flip in 180 degrees the relationship that's presumed between the person and their environment. And there are kind of numerous examples of that I've gone into in different lectures, but that's really the gist of the argument.
There was an interview. I read an interview that you did a while ago, and you were, sort of talking about your sort of research project, all the things that we're talking about today, and the interviewer asked you, sort of pointedly, like, why do you think architecture can solve these problems?
Yeah,
And your response to that, I have not been able to stop thinking about. When I read that, you said, I don't think architecture is capable of solving anything, but it is an excellent platform to pose problems.
yeah,
And I'm wondering if you could talk about that. And I think we're starting to get to that a little bit, but how do we sort of shift from architecture as building,
Yeah,
architecture as problem solving,
yeah.
to architecture as set of ideas, set of principles, set of, platforms to pose these problems as opposed to solve them?
I mean, so this is a kind of methodological given in my work, which is to think really precisely about how a problem comes to us. Yeah.
Mm,
But like
mm,
we think problems are kind of just out there. And as students or as practicing architects, we kind of take them on board, like they're kind of ready made. Um, but I think the way that they've come to us is always structured by certain kinds of historical and political forces.
mm,
Um, so you could think about something like homelessness,
right.
and you would see that some people would pose that problem in terms of a shortfall of housing construction, which might be one way of posing the problem, and it would lead to certain kinds of responses. Another way of posing the problem would be to talk about the commodification of housing and the fact that, well, actually, we have plenty of houses that just happen to be empty because they're used as investment vehicles.
Right. Right.
So I'm always really interested and in kind of turning the problem around in my head and working out how many different ways can I come at it. And I think architecture is really a kind of wonderful way of giving us the skills to do that. And so I think um, there's an enormous amount of political power in posing a problem in a new and persuasive way, because
Mm,
problems have a kind of gravitational force field,
yeah. Yeah.
and you can think about the way kind of sustainability as a certain formulation of the kind of the climate crisis for so long exerted so much power on our field and made us think about the problem in a certain kind of way. Um, but if someone comes and says, actually, the problem is about ecology,
Right.
then suddenly uh,
Right.
all of the methods and approaches need to be, reappraised and reorganized because the problem's formulated in a completely different way. And when someone says to you, actually, ecology just doesn't mean the natural world; it also means your mental health and your well-being. Then suddenly,
Right.
you're kind of turning it around. And so that kind of reformulation of the problem, I think, is a very powerful political thing that we can do. And because you can put it in the world, it can start to organize a field.
I love that. There's so much about that I feel like we could talk about, and so much of your work. You've been so involved in architecture education for most of your career. You're the dean of the School of Architecture at the Royal College of Art, which we'll talk about more specifically in a bit. But I'm interested in sort of how you think about this project of decolonizing architecture, of expanding our definitions of what architecture, and maybe for our purposes we could say architecture and design.
Yeah.
um how does that actually change how we talk about it in the classroom, or how we structure a curriculum, or how we give students the tools to craft their own redefinitions, or be participants in this decolonization project?
Well, first of all, on graduation, I worked for someone in Australia called Richard Goodwin. He's a really extraordinary artist trained as an architect, working across different scales. From we were working on freeway infrastructure and roads,
Mm,
working on buildings, but he also had a artistic practice and was doing public installation work, showing in galleries, and
oh
what was
wow.
really for me wonderful about that experience, besides being a kind of extraordinary education and him being a really wonderful mentor, um, we didn't spend much time thinking about like where the disciplinary boundaries of architecture stopped
Right.
and something like art practice might start. It was always
Right.
quite fuzzy, and it felt comfortable, and there wasn't a lot of guilt associated with it. Kind of
Right.
just the work went where it needed to go, and I think that was a really the kind of spirit of that meant that the work was evolving out of a kind of very serious and rigorous practice. And it's something that I think I was just talking to my colleagues about the other day. And so if and maybe this is a kind of lead into the Royal College of Art. So if you're an artist and you come to a master's program to study fine arts, the idea that you have a practice will be taken really seriously.
Mm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and the time that you're there, um, it was spent trying to cultivate and nurture that practice. Yeah, um, and I realized that we have that same ethos in the School of Architecture, except we 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 direct it towards architecture students. That is to say that when they come in, we take seriously the idea that they already have a practice. Yeah,
Mm.
they've
Hmm.
just finished an undergraduate degree in architecture or another field. They might be quite confused about what they're doing, but we dignify their experiences in the world
Yeah,
and say they're important, and we take the idea that they have a practice seriously, and we try to nurture it. So there's something of the ethos of a kind of fine arts disposition towards education,
that's
but
interesting. Yeah.
applied to an architectural context, which I think is really unique.
Yeah, and so I again, sorry to kind of quote back another thing that you said in an interview, but you said something that in an interview a couple years ago, that you weren't interested in policing distinctions, between disciplines. And I think that's something that you and I have in common. We're sort of interested in these expanded definitions, and I'm wondering how you think about that within a larger institution. You're the dean of the School of Architecture. And that comes with a lot of baggage, and there are other departments that you have to sort of interface with. How do you sort of think about sort of maintaining a, and maybe I'm even asking this question in the wrong way, but like maintaining a core or maintaining some sort of definition, but also being aware that it is blurry and amorphous.
Yeah, no, exactly, and I think it's really important to hold those two things together. So, for example, what I described before in terms of the applicability of architecture as a structure of knowledge outside of building.
Mhm.
Um, in order to produce uh, that knowledge, you need a really serious engagement with the history of the discipline
Right, right.
and with building and with construction, and so those skills don't come out of nowhere, and so um, it's less about moving away from commitments that we have to what contemporary architectural practice should look like, which we have those commitments, and they might not be the same as other people's commitments. We have those commitments, um, but it's less guilt ridden about pulling people in from the perimeters of those interests back into the center,
Yeah, yeah.
and because we see those things as starting points, as entry points, and I think we're trying to continually dignify our students' own experiences, such that they can also flourish as they come into contact with all of the various opportunities that exist in the RCA. I mean, one really incredible thing about the Royal College of Art is it's also kind of naturally interdisciplinary as a context.
Mm, yeah,
So, having taught at other institutions where there are long-standing intergenerational debates around
right.
what you should or shouldn't do, or what you should or shouldn't read, um, I think that the really great thing about the RCA is we don't really feel those same kinds of pressures. So as a dean, it's never really been difficult. I think we have a more complex and nuanced problem. So we have an interior design program,
Hmm.
and we have an architecture program, which is the professionally accredited program. There's a city design program, so it's a more urban scale,
Right.
and there's an environmental architecture program, which is something that we developed um, as a contemporary response to everything I was talking about at the beginning around resource extraction. So
Right.
it's
Right.
not landscape architecture, but it's thinking about land rights struggles, territorial
Oh,
scales
interesting.
of design, et cetera, et cetera. And then the interesting thing that we have is there's so much cross fertilization between all of those different scales and
Uh,
practices, um, that oftentimes it's not clear
yeah.
overlap, and that's so which is a nice thing, but it's also it makes us continually think about what makes them distinct from each other as well.
Do students come in into your program with that knowledge that you as an institution are thinking about architecture this way? I'll sort of put my cards on the table here, and I've asked this question to many people on the show
Mm.
over the years. I when I teach undergrads, I'm always sort of teaching in this with these expanded modes, these blurry definitions. I can't tell you how many times I've had a student say, like, I want to do this for a project, but I'm not sure if it's graphic design. And
Yeah.
I'm like, like, if you're doing it, it is. Like,
Yeah.
if it's
Yeah.
we're doing it in this class. And some of that is the difference between an undergraduate student and a graduate student, and pressures of getting a job and thinking about, I have to get work after this. And so if I make this weird short film, is that like, is that too weird?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if sort of how, I don't know, how you sort of prepare, how students are, how aware of students of this way of thinking are they going in? Or are there students who are thinking like, I do just want to build buildings. I do just want to make shelters,
Yeah.
how do you sort of talk about that tension?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is that yes, absolutely. Now, after I've been dean for 9 years, and so um, people come to the school for a specific reason,
Mm,
and they come because they want to study architecture in this interdisciplinary context alongside artists and designers, and graphic designers and fashion designers and sculptors and photographers, etc. And so they've already given themselves permission to have a kind of proximity to the fine arts and
right.
design in a broader sense, which is great. And I think that's fantastic for us. But there's a ton of people that come that want to pursue um, architecture as building, as it's known. They want to pursue interior design as building, or
Hmm.
civil design as a kind of, master planning project. And it's really important that space exists for those practices. And
Right.
a large part of the school is people who come at things in that way. And it's actually, I don't think we've ever been in a position of thinking it's one or the other. It's actually the relationship between someone who wants to produce textile as their graduating project in an architecture degree, which has happened in the past, or wants to work in glass blowing to model. Um, that's You can do that, yeah. But there are also people producing, you know, um, what might look like a conventional documentation package for a building. So it's a mix.
Yeah, I mean, even hearing you say that, it's almost it in and of itself is a sort of decolonizing project, also. And you use the phrase about sort of like the people operating at the perimeters, bringing them into the center.
Yeah,
And what I'm sort of hearing you say is that there actually really isn't a center. It's just
yeah,
all of these things are sort of, one doesn't take precedence over the other. There's not like
yeah.
a traditional practice and experimental practice or
Exactly.
whatever. It's they're all valid in their own ways.
Exactly. And a large part of that has been our response as faculty to the students that are coming in. And so we've
Hmm.
been working really hard to diversify the faculty. So to diversify the faculty and student intake. And when you have students that come in with different life experiences,
Right, right.
um, you also just you can't, I think it's not right to tell them that their life experiences are not
Right,
relevant
totally, yeah.
in this context. Actually, when someone comes to you with different life experiences, and that could be because of their cultural background, it could be because of their class background, or any other reason, um, then we have to take, if we're taking their practice seriously, then we have to take that experience. And so we need to be able to respond to them and to work
Mhm.
out, what they've brought into the institution, and to use that as the starting point. And we're not always very good at doing that.
Right.
Good thing to do. And
Yeah.
I think we're much better at it, but it's a kind of work in progress.
I mean, you've been in this position for 9 years, like you said, and I'm curious how you think about being a dean, being, in a position where you are both, sort of helping set a research agenda, but also acting as an administrator, thinking about, all of these moving parts. How is being a dean and running a school of architecture a type of design project? Like, how do you approach that as a designer, as an architect?
Yeah, oh my god, there's a really long answer to this.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to give you the short answer. I
Okay.
think you absolutely have to believe in institution building as a project,
Mm,
and and you have to see the institution as a design project. Yeah. That is to say, everything from the interpersonal conduct of people to each
yeah.
other, the administrative structures that you have place, the opportunities that people have to surface discomfort or conflict or power relationships that they feel uncomfortable with. Um, how do we reflect on ourselves as a school, and how does that self-reflection become a practice and a critical practice, and how do you do that while at the same time nurturing colleagues,
Right.
dealing with people's life circumstances as they pass through moments of like confidence and vulnerability. um, you know there's while maintaining all the kind of financial
Right.
developing research culture. And it's one of the things that's it's a research led teaching practice in the school, and
Right.
research culture is important because I've been in so many other institutions where people find themselves in careers that are kind of funneling down into a cul-de-sac.
Right.
um, and it generates all kinds of neurosis and anxiety. It's really hard work. It's really the most difficult thing I've ever done. And because the default position of the institution is kind of anxiety and paranoia, you know
Right. Yes.
and so
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
we've all worked in universities before. We know that's
Yeah.
what they default to,
Right.
and so the amount of work required to keep them kind of open and secure, but also kind of vital and dynamic, but without producing precarity and insecurity. It's really,
Yeah.
really complicated, but it's absolutely a design project. But it's one you kind of embody, and I think it's also one my colleagues embody as well, and have really taken on.
Yeah, I think it's so well said and it's so true. It is very true. And what's interesting to me about that and talking about that sort of vulnerability and paranoia and precarity,
Yeah,
in many ways it sort of goes back to your first answer about this intersection between decarbonization and decolonization and this mindset of extraction,
yeah,
of financializing everything, about seeing what you can take. And I'm wondering how you sort of apply, we've been talking about these ideas on the scale of the
mm,
planet, on the scale of
mm,
the city.
mm.
How does that research actually influence how you manage the school, how you organize the research culture, how you sort of interact with students and faculty, because it's sort of it's the same issues just on a smaller scale.
Absolutely. That's a really, really, really profoundly important question, and it's also difficult to answer. So, and I think the US is in a slightly different position to this, but certainly in the UK, that education has become more financialized. Of course, we have
Hmm.
shared issues in student debt. The student debt issue in the US is arguably a lot worse than here. Um, but in the UK, the your research output is the word used to describe it,
Mm.
is quantified and assessed in a nationwide assessment process that takes place every
Right.
5 years, and your time is subject to different kinds of metrics, whether it be student feedback and
Hmm.
et cetera, et cetera. And so education in both the US and the UK, and in fact maybe less so around the world, maybe Australia and Canada as well, um, is more and more subject to things that uh, processes of like counting and assessment and
Mm.
quantification. um, and I think that's been really challenging for academics everywhere, and researchers everywhere. And so I think that the approach that we take to it is really practical. I think we have to fulfill those expectations, and um, but also not see them as an end in themselves,
Right. Right.
and see them as a kind of collateral of what we're really trying to do, which is create a transformative experience for students, and to produce research that has meaning in the world. And so, yeah, there's a really long bureaucratic answer to that. I
Yeah.
just trying to
Well, Adrian,
find my way around it.
if there's any podcast where you can give long bureaucratic
I
answers about administration, you are on it. This is the show for that. I've I have a couple questions to wrap up
yeah.
this conversation. I'm interested in what you're thinking about now. What's sort of top of mind for you? What's next for you? Where do you see this research that you're doing going next?
Yeah. Look, I think we've just come off a really successful few years. I think we were
Mm-hmm.
really had an amazing, of course, the recent Venice Architecture Biennale curated by Leslie Loco, which is really also about these themes that we've
Yeah.
raised today around decarbonization and decolonization. We see like a first generation of alumni coming through the school, a first generation of faculty coming through the school, participating in that event. And actually, one of the things I'm really interested in now is a kind of intergenerational relationship. Yeah.
Mm.
So how do those that new generation of alumni and faculty that are going out into the world doing all these fantastic things? So there was, I don't know, 22 or 23 people out of the 90 people curated by Leslie were from the school.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
which is a kind of extraordinary. And if someone had told me that at the beginning of my tenure as dean, I would have not believed them. So this generation is starting to get recognition, and things that were considered really um, on the fringes of the discipline 9 years ago when we started, running studios
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
indigenous groups looking at resource extraction, or running a multi-year studio in the Atacama Desert, as my colleague Godofredo Pereira did, or working, in Borneo, on palm oil plantations, which is what Christina Jarrett was doing for a number of years. These things that were actually really not considered part of architectural education.
Right.
I've seen now many, many other institutions really wholeheartedly embrace those kinds of practices, and I think that's really, for me, extremely, extremely exciting. And my own work, and I think my reflection on the institution at that moment is to actually, and again, this is part of, and again, it is a way, a kind of response to your question about the institution, which
Mm.
is how do we start to think about this in intergenerational terms?
Yeah.
How do we think about this as from a longer term perspective, and start to build in some of those practices, not only in the school, but in the wider world, in the profession. Yeah. Um, in the bodies that accredit architecture degrees and programs. And I think for me, that's the really exciting next phase of all of this, which is a kind of broader formalization and institutionalization of what's happening in the school.
Yeah. I mean, you started answering what my follow up question was going to be, which is sort of where you see architecture and design education going next. If there's sort of other issues or topics or focus um, that are on the margins that we need to bring into the core. Are there others that we haven't talked about that you're sort of seeing on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me that um, the two major shifts that have taken place in the last uh, 10 years is the incorporation of like insights from Black studies and from
Mm-hmm.
decolonial studies as well into architecture. And I
Mm-hmm.
think what they've pointed us to is vast gaps in our knowledge of history. So
Right.
also just basic, historical documentation of, non-Western forms of architecture, or, the role of architecture or space in
Yeah.
histories of social struggles around the world. And actually, I'm really against the idea that there's like a next thing, uh, because I think this thing's going to take a really long time to work out, you know. And I think and I think what I'm hoping is that next generations of scholars and PhD students and practitioners um, will slowly start to recover all those really important lost histories, and they will start to make us think very differently about
Yeah.
how we practice in the present, and hopefully give us clues around what kind of alternative, forms of life and relationships to the world might be possible outside of the domination of extraction.
Yeah.
And for me, that's there is no other project. That's the project.
I love that. I mean, next thing was maybe not the right. It was more like, what else are on those margins? What else is on that perimeter? I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, and I think I really feel like we're just literally scratching the surface with this.
Yes. Good name of the show reference there.
Yeah. Completely unintentional, but
I appreciate it.
You send me the check.
I think that's a good way to wrap up. So I'm going to ask you the last question, actually, that I used to end all of these. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
What I'm reading?
Yeah.
I'm reading The Wretched of the Earth by Fanon. Yeah.
Adrian, I enjoyed this conversation so much. I really admire what you're doing, and really appreciate the generosity of this conversation. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much. And also, thank you for being such a wonderful interlocutor. I really, really enjoyed it.
That was my conversation with Adrian Lahoud. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is and always will be free, thanks to the generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.